This video is going to be a quick overview of the history of atomic models. It's going to correspond to lesson 4 in your atom note packet. Whenever I talk about the history of the atom, I like to start out with this picture of the Eiffel Tower. This was taken about 10 years after it was constructed, and as you can see, it's being struck by lightning. Lightning specifically, and electrical charge in general, were seen as this mysterious force that only showed up once in a while in everyday life. It was kind of removed from us as human beings. But what we're going to see in this presentation is that that's actually not true. Right? Electrical charge is fundamental to the structure of the atom, and therefore it's actually fundamental to reality. So before we go any further, let's introduce the golden rule of charge. And that is that opposites attract and likes repel. Opposite electrical charges, like positive and negative, will attract each other. And like electrical charges, like two positives or two negatives, will repel one another. And you're already familiar with this when it comes to magnets. If you put a north pole of one magnet next to the south pole of another magnet, they'll attract. However, if you put two north poles or two south poles together, they'll repel. And the same thing's true of positive and negative charges. So the atom's a scientific model, and this model has been in development for over 4,000 years. A model is usually a representation, it's a simplification of something in nature, and oftentimes in chemistry, a model will be used to describe things we can't see. Successful models are models that are often mathematical and are often used to both describe and predict things that we'll see in nature. So the beginning of this 4,000-year journey of the atom starts out with Democritus, who was an ancient Greek philosopher from thousands of years ago. He suggested that if he had an object, say a piece of paper, and he kept tearing it in half over and over again, he would eventually reach a smallest possible piece that he couldn't divide anymore. And he described this piece as atomos, or indivisible, and that's where we get the word atom. Now, the idea of the atom was more of a philosophical idea than an actual idea for most of human history, right up until the beginning of the 19th century. The man who took a philosophy and turned it into a scientific model was John Dalton. John Dalton was the first model of the atom that you actually need to be aware of. So Dalton conducted multiple experiments in the early 1800s, including using electricity to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. And the results of these experiments was his mental image of the atom as an indivisible sphere, kind of like the marble that I have in the upper right-hand corner of the slide. And there were four main ideas to Dalton's model. The first one was that all elements are composed of tiny spheres called atoms. The second was that atoms of the same element are identical, and atoms of different elements are different. And we know this is somewhat true today, right? All atoms of the same element have the same number of protons, even though they may still have different numbers of neutrons. Atoms of different elements can be mixed together physically, and we discussed this when we talked about heterogeneous versus homogeneous mixtures, or they can be combined chemically in whole number ratios. So they can be combined chemically and lose their original properties to form something new, such as hydrogen and oxygen, two colorless gases, forming water, a colorless liquid. And these combinations always existed in a whole number ratio. So for water, a 2-to-1 ratio is true of every water molecule. And then finally, Dalton said, chemical reactions occur when atoms rearrange themselves into different combinations. But an atom of one element, it never turns into an atom of another element. And again, many of these ideas that Dalton came up with were true today. So Dalton's ideas were improved upon by a man by the name of J.J. Thomson. So in the late 19th century, Thomson conducted what is sometimes called a cathode ray experiment. So a cathode ray tube is what's shown in this diagram here. And a cathode ray tube is a piece of glass where the air has been removed. The tube was connected to two metals that were connected to a high voltage source. And this is basically what the setup of a old school pre-2005 television looked like. And when this voltage was turned on, you could see green rays. And among these many experiments with these green rays that Thomson conducted, he put electrically charged plates on either side. And what he found was these green rays were always bent towards the positively charged plate. And if you remember our golden rule of charge, if these rays are being attracted to the positive plate, they must contain negative particles, and these negative particles were eventually discovered to be electrons. So I'm just going to show you a quick animation of this. So this is Thomson's setup, and again, he's got his glass cathode ray tube. He's got two metals connected to a high voltage source, and when that voltage source is turned on, the cathode produces these rays. Okay, visibly sometimes they're seen as green rays, and they were aimed at this detection screen. And when Thomson applied electrically charged plates, one positive and one negative, what you'll see is that this ray of particles bent towards the positive plate. And again, if we remember that opposite electrical charges attract, he assumed that they were negative, which they are. So Thomson came up with a new model of the atom based on these experiments, which he described as the plum pudding model, all right, after a type of dessert from that era that involved pudding and raisins, which to me always sounds disgusting. Right? But most importantly, the plum pudding model stated that most of the volume of the atom, right, this gray sphere you can see in this picture, is a positive diffuse sphere. So diffuse is kind of like fog, right? There's not a lot there. And within this positively diffuse sphere were these negatively charged electrons kind of randomly embedded in it. And I always make the analogy to a chocolate chip cookie, right? So most of the volume of a chocolate chip cookie is dough. So in our atom, we would have this positively charged dough, and then embedded within that would be negatively charged chocolate chips. Thomson's model is super important because it's the first model to actually introduce electrical charge into the atom, where most of the volume is positive and little bits of negative are distributed throughout it. Thomson's model of the atom was improved even further by experiments by Ernest Rutherford. So in his famous gold foil experiment, Rutherford had a very thin piece of gold foil, which you can see here in the middle of the diagram. And this gold foil was kind of like aluminum foil, but it was hammered really, really, really thin to the point where it's closer to tissue paper. And he surrounded that foil with a detection screen that would glow in the places where radiation came in contact with it. He also had a radioactive source, which was protected in a lead box, that would release positively charged alpha particles. And he directed these alpha particles at his gold foil in the center of the screen. Now, what's interesting is Rutherford actually expected the particles to go through, right? Which may seem kind of strange, but if you remember, Thomson's model said that the atom was what? Mostly a positively charged, diffuse, or foggy sphere. So he expected most of the particles to go through, which you can see in this diagram. What he actually saw was most of the particles did go through, but about 1 in every 800 got either deflected off course, and you can see some of them bending off course, or actually repelled back. Now, if you think back to our golden rule of charge, positively charged alpha particles getting deflected by something in these atoms means that they're coming in contact with something that is also positive. This is an example of like charges repelling. So from this key observation that 1 in every 800 particles was deflected, while the other 799 went through, Rutherford came up with two conclusions. And the first one was that there must be a dense, positively charged nucleus in the center of every atom. You can see that here in this gray sphere. We'd later discover that the nucleus contains 99% of the mass of the atom. Because the vast majority of the particles actually went through, his second conclusion was that most of the volume of the atom is empty space. So a dense positively charged nucleus in the center, and again, it's positive because positive alpha particles are being repelled. But the fact that most of them are going through was a clue that most of the volume is empty space. Now, what about Thomson's electrons from the previous model? Well, those electrons were later discovered to be hanging out in that mostly empty space. So Rutherford's model was the first to discuss a nuclear model of the atom, and it was also the first to separate electrical charge so that all the positive charge and later the neutrons were in the nucleus in the center, while the electrons were outside the nucleus. Now, just to give a little bit of scale here, here's Phoenix's newly completed football field. And if you were to take a quarter and put it on the 50-yard line, right there in the center of the Firebird, the rest of the diameter of the atom, that mostly empty space, would basically be end zone to end zone, and that's where the electrons would be hanging out. So in conclusion, in this presentation, we've talked about 3 out of the 5 models of the atom that you need to be aware of. And the first major scientific version of the atom was Dalton, and he thought the atom was an indivisible sphere, right? A sphere that could not be split. And he got this through various experiments, and he came up with his 4 main ideas, one of the most important of which is that all atoms of the same element are the same. Thomson came up with the plum pudding model. His major observation was during his cathode ray experiments, his cathode rays bent towards a positively charged electrical plate, which means they must have been negative. And therefore, he assumed that the atom was made up of these negatively charged particles. And because whenever you have negative charge, you have to have positive charge, the rest of the volume of the atom must be a positively diffuse sphere. Rutherford was the first to give us a nuclear model. He conducted his gold foil experiment, and his key observation was that 1 in every 800 of his alpha particles was actually deflected instead of going straight through the foil. And his 2 main conclusions from this observation were, 1, there must be a dense positively charged nucleus in the center, and 2, most of the volume is empty space. And as you can see in this picture, who's hanging out in most of that empty space? It's the electrons, kind of like satellites orbiting the Earth. Again, what were the improvements of each atom? Dalton was the first one to say that atoms of the same element are the same, which we know to be mostly true today. Thomson was the first to introduce the idea of positive and negative charge within an element. And what Rutherford did is he separated this charge. All of the positive charge would be found in the nucleus, while the negative electrons would circle the space around the nucleus.